Assalamu alaikum everybody. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Bismillah wahid al-Qahar. In the name of the Almighty, the All-Merciful, the Mercy-Giving. In the name of the One and the Conqueror. I'd like to thank iccnc for inviting me tonight for this auspicious occasion. I have to give you a disclaimer first, in case there might be some confusion. I'm not a religious scholar. I am not a priest or an imam or a rabbi. Sometimes people can confuse that. But I am interested in the topic of language and identity. And that methodology and that approach will be demonstrated in the celebration of one of the unique symbols and archetypes in the world. And so for the last 25 years or so, I have been interested in a question that never seems to be uninteresting and answerable in a lot of ways. It is the question of identity. Who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going? All we know is we are in this world. We're in a galaxy amongst hundreds of galaxies, thousands of galaxies. And we're here for a short while. And during this time, we're trying to answer this question of who we are. What is our place and location in this world? And to this journey, to these questions, we apply many tools. We apply cultural tools, religious tools, tools that we sometimes choose ourselves, but a lot of times are chosen for us. And so as we navigate this question, or these questions, we're constantly trying to solve this mystery of who we are. And to these conversations come heroes and heroines who embody certain traits, certain characteristics. And Fāṭimah is one of those global and universal archetypes. But what is an archetype? An archetype is a synthesis, is an extraction of the best ideals that a culture has come to celebrate and emulate across time and space. In the language of the Quran, this is sometimes referred to as the uswatu hasana, the supreme model, the supreme example. But I'd like to bring this conversation into some of the ways in which archetypes have been studied, especially in the modern world. The psychologist Joseph Campbell is well known, inspired by Carl Jung, is inspired by the Hero's Journey. And the way he developed this model was that he studied three major civilizational archetypes. He studied the story of Buddha. He studied the story of Moses. And he studied the story of Jesus. And from studying these three personalities and heroes of civilization, he developed this model. A journey of the self, a journey of self-discovery, a way to answer those questions that are on our minds and in our hearts all the time. And the way we try to embrace those questions through language itself, through symbols, through stories. And each of us is a hero. And each of us is trying to answer those questions and figure out the mystery of the self. But there is one more level of this. See, the hero's archetype is based on three male figures. Three male figures who came from a position of privilege. They came from a position in which they were part of the high class of society. They were men, and they were looked up to. But the heroine's journey is a journey that is not one of privilege. Does not start from a position of privilege. You know the story of the Buddha. He was an Indian prince, right? He was an Indian prince who left the world in order to discover himself. And ultimately he found enlightenment and nirvana, and you know the rest of the story. The same thing with Moses. Moses was someone who was raised in the castle and in the house of the Pharaoh. And then he spent time in exile and a journey of self-discovery, and led the children of Israel in that journey. The same thing with Jesus. He was a person from the well-known class, a person who came from an established order. But the heroine's journey starts from a position that is not one of privilege. They have to overcome patriarchy. They have to overcome chauvinism, male domination. And in some ways, the heroine's journey is the more complete story for how we all become self-actualized and discover who we are and answer those questions that are most important to our journey. We see that the logos and the archetype of Fāṭimah, Fāṭimah Zahrāʼ, in so many different aspects of culture. In popular culture, we see that in this story, La Mano de Fāṭimah, the hand of Fāṭimah, it is a story of a young man during the time in which the Jews and the Muslims were being thrown out of Spain, and he falls in love with a girl named Fāṭimah. And in this story, it talks about how he tries to reconcile and bring together all these warring factions, all of this meaningless hate that is dominating society. And so that is one place that we see the archetype of Fāṭimah. Another archetype you all are familiar with is how in Iranian culture and Iranian society, Dr. Ali Shariati brought this question to the people and tried to resuscitate and resurrect people's identity through the archetype of Fāṭimah. And by asking who is Fāṭimah, he was really provoking people to ask who they are. Where do they stand? Now what's interesting about Dr. Shariati's perspective is he comes from a socialist Marxist perspective, and he interweaves that with a religious methodology. But we see that that question was not something that Dr. Shariati was asking for the first time. We see Lenin asking that question. We see many other scholars asking the question of who am I? What needs to be done? And what they argue is that if a society, if a people are not asking this question, then they are steeped in deep darkness. For example, in the Dark Ages, for 500-600 years, the time between Jesus and the rise of Islam, people were not asking that question of identity. People were just living their routine lives, accepting the status quo, the existing order. They weren't questioning anything. And by raising the question, it is the beginning of life. It is the beginning of self-discovery. Within the Iranian context, we see that we have lived through many archetypes, heroines, that have helped us in the journey of identity. Jacob Cohen, in this brilliant book, talks about two major archetypes that have defined the heroine's identity within the Iranian context, from Esther to Fāṭimah. And one of the things that these two archetypes have in common, and are so fundamental to how Iranians, and by extension other communities who were inspired by that system, that both of these stories, and right now we're kind of in that season, we're in the season of Purim, which basically the story of Esther is kind of a central feature, and we're also looking at the story of Fāṭimah. And both of them are unique in the sense that they are hidden. Esther, her original name is Hadassa, meaning hidden. She lives in she's brought to the court of the king, and she has to hide who she really is, because the king has enacted a policy to basically kill off their whole people, all of the children of Israel. So she hides her identity and engages with this opponent, with the king at that time, and eventually through those dialogues is able to reverse the policy. And that is why she is celebrated as a heroine. And in the same way, we see that when it comes to the story of Fatima Zahra, she is the greatest mystery when it comes to all of the heroes and heroines in the Iranian and in the Islamic consciousness. Her grave is unknown. It is unmarked. The circumstances are mysterious. Her name is not clearly located in one culture, and we'll get into that a little bit later when we get into the journey of the name. And it is through that mystery and through that journey that people have to locate themselves and find themselves in relation to these major archetypes. We fast forward to, and what I'm really doing here is trying to show you how far-reaching the archetype of Fāṭimah is. How many of you have heard of this story? There's a city in Portugal called Fāṭimah. Originally, it was named after the daughter of the caliph of that time. But in 1917, 3 young girls see a vision of Fāṭimah, and to this day, the Catholic Church is celebrating this occasion. In fact, last year was the centennial, and they do mass pilgrimages to remember Fāṭimah in this city. And one of the interesting points of convergence that is always discussed is, why did the Virgin Mary, because that's their belief, right? Why would she appear in this city? So Fāṭimah is Esther, Fāṭimah is Mary. If you go and look through all the books, you'll see there's at least 135 names for Fāṭimah. And that is the characteristic of an archetype. It starts to embody all of these characteristics, all of these ideals that people are aspiring to and trying to find themselves in and move towards. But in this story, the apparitions of Our Lady Fāṭimah, the Catholic Church and many scholars of Catholicism have noted this interesting convergence, that by appearing in this spot, in this area, it is as if Fāṭimah is calling to the entire world, to all of the religions, to all the people, to put down their differences and transcend their ego and to become genuine heroes and heroines. Because that is ultimately what the hero's journey is to rise above selfish desires, selfish ego, and become one part of a grander story, a bigger story of what it means to be human beings. And one of the interesting names, when they talk about this apparition, they talk about the Lady of the Rosary. Now, if you all know, the translation of rosary is tasbih. Right? So basically we could say that the apparition, when these girls came back and said we spoke to this image, and one of the messages of this image was to pray my rosary daily. And you see that this image and this idea is very pervasive in the Catholic world. And when we talk about the Catholic world, we're talking about 2 billion people. We're talking about South America. We're talking about Europe. We're talking about Africa. Right? You see, I'm taking this archetype, Fāṭimah, and expanding it as a bigger symbol that is used for identity, to fulfill the hero and heroine's journey. But I want to take a moment to have you reflect on this, one of the names, one of the 135 names of Fāṭimah. The Lady of the Rosary, the tasbih, that's rosary, right? The Lady of the tasbih. Now you all might have heard of the Tasbih al-Zahrāʼ, right? The Tasbih al-Zahrāʼ has an interesting story. In the Islamic eschatology, it is said that the lady, that Fāṭimah Zahrā asks her husband, Imam Ali, to hire more help, to help with the work around the house. And the Prophet comes to her and says, I have something for you, a gift for you, that is greater. And this is the Tasbih al-Zahrāʼ. This is the 34 Allahu Akbars, the 33 Subhanallahs, and the 33 Alhamdulillahs that are recommended to do right after prayer, right? It is a way of connecting. And that's what the rosary is. It is a repeated zikr. So every salat, every prayer will have this, in order for it to become complete, in order for its connection to become complete, is to be concluded with this Tasbih al-Zahrāʼ. So the message of Fāṭimah on May 13th, 1917 in Portugal was to do the Tasbih of Fāṭimah, to do the rosary. And this is a message that is a way for human beings to really fulfill their heroic journey of finding themselves. Because what is tasbih? What is salat anyway? And this is where you have to kind of go deeper into the language, right? Salat is not prayer. Salat comes from the word sil'a, meaning connection. What we typically call prayer or tasbih is something very different than salat. And so when we are engaged in this salah, we are connecting. We are not calling, we're not doing dua. We are connecting to the Almighty. We're connecting to the universal truth. We are connecting to each other, right? And that is the only way we can transcend and become something bigger than we are by ourselves. So this is the formula that was recommended and is celebrated by 2 billion Catholics in the world, to do the prayer of the Rosary daily. Now the Muslims are supposed to be doing this too, but they might not know that this is tasbih. They might not know that this is part of the Salat. But this is what connects and allows the human being to think about who they are in relation to the universal currents that are happening. We see that this archetype, in Jewish tradition, the archetype of Fāṭimah is equated with the story of Esther. We see that the Catholics have equated, because you can see in this image of the apparition in Fāṭimah, that she has with her both symbols that are known to the Muslims, symbols that are known to the Jews, and symbols that are familiar to the Catholics. And it's all embodied in one place. And that is what makes the study of Fāṭimah so a little bit more complex, because she doesn't belong to one physical location. She doesn't belong to one tribe. In fact, her name in the Arabic language is not an Arabic word. It is a combination of different languages. Because Arabic, as you know, is a root system, right? If you try to look for the root of the name of Fāṭimah in the Arabic concordance, you won't find it. And we'll get into that a little bit more. And this is what the linguistic methodology is so useful. That when a name is a hybrid name, a name is a name that doesn't belong to one tribe, one linguistic community, is already a name that is designed to transcend those artificial boundaries that human beings tend to make. Because not only is the ego of the self a danger to our heroic journey, but the ego, the collective ego of tribe and nation, can be a more debilitating obstacle. And those are all idols that we have to break and overcome in the hero and heroine's journey. When we come to the Muslim world, it is very interesting to see how this archetype has been appropriated and how it's been misappropriated. We know that the first university, one of the, if in some would argue there's other ones, but arguably one of the first major universities in Egypt was named after Fāṭimah. Al-Azhar University was designed during the Fāṭimiyya period in Egypt. And its heyday was during that 300-year period. Philosophical books from the Greeks, readings from all over the place were housed in this library. It was a place of learning and enlightenment and education. And then it closed down. The one famously known as Salahuddin, the corrector religion, came in and started burning all the books and destroyed, because he wanted to destroy the legacy of the Fāṭimiyya. And so it was the beginning of the dark ages of the Muslim world. That once you start burning books, once you start attacking intellectual artifacts, once you start destroying history in the name of a narrow, ceremonial, backwards religion, or should I say a backwards version of religion, this major ignorance that we are experiencing in today's world began with the burning and the closing down of this university. That's one of its flashpoint moments. But the legacy is still there. It is still called Al-Azhar University. So all it has preserved is the name, but not the meaning, not the heart. And this is why we talk about the heart of language. That you could still have the label. You could still have the flesh of language. But it might be devoid of the hero and heroine's journey that that name is pointing to. And that is why it's important for us to go beyond the surface and go deeper into our analysis of the words and the names that we are given to figure out who we are. I wanted to also point out that at Al-Azhar University, you had one of the major scholars of the Jewish world. In fact, they call him the second Moses. This is Maimonides, also known as Rambam. This is his statue, but he was celebrated to give one of the last intellectual presentations and talks at Al-Azhar University before Salahuddin. Salahuddin didn't do anything to him because he was the best physician. But that was the lasting legacy. So Al-Azhar University kind of is a symbol, is an archetype of where the world, especially the Muslim world, has come to this point and what it needs to recover in order to be able to disentangle itself from all this confusion and narrow-mindedness and reductive approaches to the questions of who we are, right? I wanted to now drill down a little bit, make this a little more practical for us. Why is this important? Why are we looking at the language closely like this? There are two words that I think are very important to how we navigate the question of identity today, right? There is the word Muslim and there's the word Fāṭimah. These are the two words I want to kind of get into today. Now the word Muslim, if you were to look it up, well, let me ask you, where does it come from? Where does the word Muslim, this word that was handed to you as a child, and you've been negotiating who you are through this word. Sometimes it means an ethnicity. Sometimes it means you're part of this tribe. Sometimes it can mean many things, right? It's translated as submission, right? Who introduced this concept to the world? Where did it come from? What are its roots? We call this in linguistics etymology, where we dig deep into the roots of a word and try to understand where it comes from, how is it used, and then how is it transformed over time. Because ultimately, it's how we use it that defines it, right? This manuscript is from the book of Isaiah. The book of Isaiah is one of the latter prophets that's found in the Old Testament. In fact, it is one of the most authentic manuscripts that archaeologists and scientists have been able to locate. You may have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the manuscripts that they were able to uncover in the Dead Sea Scrolls was the book of Isaiah. And the book of Isaiah is a significant one in terms of our discussion today. It's going to help us unpack these two words that shape our heroine and hero's journey. Here's a verse from chapter 42, verse 19. Now, I'm going to start with the translation. Who is blind but my servant, or deaf as my messenger that I sent? Who is blind as he that is perfect? This is the English translation of the transcript. Take a few minutes to look at this other translation. And this is the commentary from one of the greatest scholars of the Jewish world, right? We could call this like a tafsir almost, right? So it's the same verse. You see, who is blind but my servant and deaf as my messenger whom I will send? He who was blind is as the one who received his payment, and he who was blind is as the servant of the Lord. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of Hebrew lesson today. You see that word right there in red? What do you think it says? That's the translation right there. In the other translation, it was he who was perfect. And if you go to Google Translate and you put that Hebrew word, that's what you'll get. It is about perfection. That red word, the first letter is kaf, which means like. The second letter is mim. The third letter is sin. The fourth letter is lam. And the fifth letter is mim. So, Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, it said, my messenger whom I will send, he who was blind is like a Muslim. That's what the Hebrew is saying. So the word Muslim was not introduced by the religion of Islam that we know today. It was introduced in a book that preceded the Islam that we know today 500 years. At least. More, 500 years before Christ. The book of Isaiah is 500 years older before Jesus. So we're talking about, you do the math, 2,500 years? Huh? No, I'm talking about today. Oh yeah, before, right. But from today, we're talking about 500 years before Jesus. So that's over 2,500 years. So Isaiah is saying, do it one more time. If you go Google Translate and you type in Muslim in Hebrew, that's the definition. To become complete, to become perfect, to become accomplished, to become a model, to become flawless. What Isaiah was talking about was the internal Muslim, the spiritual Muslim. The heart becoming free of defilement, being free of selfishness, being free of self-centeredness, becoming other-oriented. So yes, to become whole, complete, entire, intact, perfect, total, immaculate, spotless, stainless, unsullied, perfect. This is the word. So, if we remember the verse, it's saying, my messenger who I sent. This is a vision that Isaiah is seeing. He's having a spiritual experience with an archetype that is free of blemish, free of any stain, free of any attachment to the world. That's the vision of Isaiah. 2,500 years ago. Rediscovered in 1972 in the caves of the Dead Sea. Something that most people are unaware of. That this idea of Muslimness was not a new idea. It was an idea that was introduced earlier, and it is as if history and the momentum of history was gradually developing and building people up to understand how to answer that original question of who we are. It is to become perfect, to become spotless, to become one with the Almighty. to release the ego, and to become submitted completely in the will of the One, the Almighty. And when we come to the word Fāṭimah, it's a very fascinating word. I had to work very hard to figure out what this word was, because there's no clear answer. I looked through the entire Arabic concordance, the 3-word, the 4-word, the 5-word, and that root, the root of that word is not there. The closest root that you find is fatara. And that's why some people say they use that as one of the attributes to talk about. I'm not going to get into what fatara is, which is interesting, but the word intact is not there. And this is the concordance. Do it again. Yeah, this is too academic, so let's just keep going. But just wanted to show that I did my homework. But further investigation revealed that the word Fāṭimah is a combination of a word that God uses in the story of Genesis. When God says, "And I created man in my image," the word for image is temunah. That means Adam, the image that God created Adam in, or the first human, however you want to see it, is the image. This is the word that's used. And this word then became translated into Greek as phantom. So you have this Greek-Hebrew combination. So the word phantom also means an image, an apparition. Do you remember when we talked about the apparition of Fāṭimah in Fāṭimah, Portugal? So you had this word phantom, which right now we've heard of Phantom of the Opera. But phantom comes from this word. It's the Greek version of temunah. And then that word in Arabic became Fāṭimah. So you have this historical evolution of a term. And then this name is used to explain that this, in fact, the Arabs use this word to mean the one who's weaned off. That means the one who's become independent. So after a baby has had their period of nursing and they become free from it, they become independent, they have now become Fāṭimah, right? Independent, right? So it's this word image. So when we say that God breathed of himself into the human being, it is literally the image of Fāṭimah is breathed into Adam. And now Adam becomes this nafs-e-wahid, this single being that is emulating this reality. So the closest image of the divine is Fāṭimah. In fact, we have a narration, right? You all know this. Now everyone knows Imam Hussein, right? You all know Imam Hussein, right? Who doesn't? That's a joke. So, if you look at the 10 greatest gatherings in human history, 7 or 8 of them are Arba'in gatherings. And one of them is the Cubs winning the World Series, which was a very religious event. For those of us from Chicago, we know that that was a very religious event, only to be canceled 1 week later by the election of Trump. But I'm not going to get political right now. Imam Hussein, as you know, is the son of Fāṭimah. He has a very powerful narration to help us understand what this image is, what the archetype of Fāṭimah is, what the Uswatu Hasana of Fāṭimah is. He says, he's talking about the Ahlul Bayt, the people of the house. He says, Nahnu hujjatullah. alaykum. We are the proofs of God upon you. Right? So, Muhammad, Ali, Hassan, Hussein, right? So we are the most perfected images, proofs of the Almighty upon you, the people. Wa Fāṭimah hujjatu alayna. And Fāṭimah is the proof upon us. So Fāṭimah is the absolute singular. So you have Ali, Hassan, Hussein, Muhammad. These are the proofs of God on the creation. And the proofs upon them, this is the image that the Almighty has taken. You see the development of this story from the very beginning of the creation of Adam? And that's what fatara means, right? Fatara in the Arabic language means to create from nothing. It's different than khalaqa. Khalaqa kullu shayn min adam. To create something from nothing, the Arabic word for that is fatara. All other creative powers is just manipulation of existing pieces, right? We call that khalaqa. That's creative. Both are translated as creation, but they're very different. Fatara is to create from nothing. So the first thing that God created from nothing is this image of Himself. And so that is, according to the Hebrew explanation of this word, is that this is the most perfect image of the divine. The closest thing to God that you can be before it becomes more multiple. It is the first nur, the first light. And the process of perfection is to extract all of the darknesses and into the light. And we talked about the word perfection, right? To extract all of the dirt and all of the imperfections and all of the injustices and to bring that into the light, that is the process of being a Muslim. So the next time someone asks you, what does it mean to be a Muslim? Say it means to be perfect. And that's why I can't say I am one. It's to become perfect with God. To become perfect and one with the entire universe. Very high definition coming from first the prophet Isaiah. So there it is. The perfect image. Temunah Muslim. The perfect image of the divine. That is what we're trying. That is the hero's journey. Venturing into the unknown. Asking the question of who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going? This was not our first go around in this universe. Our life is not just this 80, 90 years that we're here. Well, yeah, I'm very optimistic. A third of it which we sleep. So this short period we're here is part of a very long journey of self-discovery. And that's what makes us heroes and heroines. So if we were to talk about Joseph Campbell's model, where he distilled the model of Buddha, Moses, and Jesus, and came up with a psychology, a way of helping people discover their own heroism. We can add to that, basically, he's coming up with the perfect image of the divine. Because the heroine's journey, as we said, is much greater than the hero's journey. Because the hero, and the heroine could be, and when I'm talking about the heroine's journey, it could be someone male or female. It depends, it's the starting point. Are you starting from a position of privilege, where society already kind of accepts you and sees you and gives you access and all these powers? Or are you starting from a position where you have to overcome society? You have to prove that you exist there and then overcome that. And the most perfect image of the divine and the most perfect model of the heroine's journey is this. It is the feminine archetype that we see modeled and extracted all over the world with that same name. That's why that name is so powerful. The name belongs to no one, but it also belongs to everyone. Right? That is the power of a name. It has everything you need to know. It's telling a story. It is telling your story. And that is the key for us to uncover this meaning, this mystery of ourselves. One more. One more. One more. Okay. So with that, I'd like to conclude. And I want to thank you for inviting me and, having this discussion and reflection. And I'm open for any questions or comments at this point.
Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Is the name Fāṭimah was the first given to Fāṭimah Zahra, or was that name used in?
It was used before too. I believe the mother of Imam Ali's name was Fāṭimah bint Asad, right? So we have that example. I don't know of how pervasive the name was, but
Khadija's mother's name was also.
So the name was used before, but she's become the famous one. She's become the iconic one. The name has become more than just it's like these are titles, right? These are representation of a embodied meaning. Yeah.
So you have studied Fāṭimah's name in Africa, in Middle Eastern. How about Asia?
That's a good question.
Have you seen it in like Asian parts, very eastern?
I have not seen a major expression of that, but that's a good question. That's more homework for me to go and look for next time. But I think when we look at the discussion of Eastern religions in general, like Hinduism, Buddhism, and all these things, that's something that a lot of scholars and a lot of people who investigate symbolism are not really looking at those connections. But I'll give you one. There's a speech that is from Imam Ali, alayhi salam, and he says that the Hindus know me as Christian. Now, Hinduism, its major archetype is Krishna. So, obviously, when someone reads this, they go, how does this make sense? Ali only lived much later. But see, we're not talking about their body or their historical Ali. We're talking about the archetypical, the spiritual, the light of Ali, right? So that's something that I have found in kind of that brings some connection to, because Hinduism is really the root of Buddhism and all the other Eastern religions. So if you can find Ali there, then linguistically, and this is a speech that this is a lecture a thing that he said about himself, where he's talking about his own reality, his spiritual reality, not his physical reality. And really, when we are talking about the heart of language, we're talking about getting into the spiritual reality of these letters. And in the ancient world, when they looked at these letters, they didn't just look at a letter and say, this letter is a pronunciation. They looked at the letter and they saw a number. In fact, it is an ilm called ilm huruf that for the most part has not really been studied much in the modern world. But it is something that is intrinsic to the way these scriptures, not just Semitic scriptures, but also like Sanskrit, that these scriptures have to be looked at from a much more complex kind of system. These letters are not just communicating how to pronounce a sound. They're a symbol. It's like a mathematical language almost. And so if I were to ask you what is an equal sign in algebra, it's not just two lines. It's showing a relationship, right? And so conservatively, we know that the letters of the Semitic languages, and I'm including Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, all these languages, has at least 5 characteristics. It has a sound, it has a number, it has a story, it has, they call this a nur, an energy, and it also has, the letters, the letter itself has a name. The name has a meaning. So, imagine you're looking at these letters and you are not asking these questions about how to interpret this stuff. So, this is something that was very normal in the ancient world when they looked at these letters. In fact, the way we know the effect of this is when you look at, like, especially Sanskrit, there is a lot of loaded information in those transcripts, in those manuscripts. And a lot of modern inventions, and I'm not going to get into that right now, are directly connected to the study of those letters. And there's a very high connection between the Semitic language and the Eastern language of Sanskrit. So I'm sure, give me time, I'll find more connections.
A wonderful lecture. Thank you for that. You started by saying the reflection on our own soul, where we are, who we are, where we came from, and all that. And of course, you took us through the journey of understanding who we are supposed to be, the Muslim with the definition you presented. But I think the bigger part of this conversation is probably how to get there. And I'm wondering if you could briefly reflect on that.
Well, the first step is to think and reflect on the language. I mean, that's how I think, what we're doing right now is asking the question and thinking about it. A lot of thinking, a lot of meditation, a lot of reflection. And then there's practices. We have so many of these practices that help us get there. And ultimately, it's to transcend the self, the false self, the illusionary self, right? And Fāṭimah's name, I don't have time to go into all the letters, because we could spend, we have to kind of relearn the alphabet with these 5 characteristics in mind to start to see how can we meditate and think about these letters. But to give you a simple answer, it is, perfecting ones. It's what has always been said. Why are prophets sent? Why are guides coming? Why are they here? We have not been sent except to perfect the creation. Inni bu'ithtu limakarima akhlaq, right? We have not been raised up except to bring dignity and honor to the nature of our creation. And so we got to know who we are. We are spiritual beings. We're not just nafsa amara. We are divine beings. And we are supposed to be the Khalifa of Allah, the representation of God in the creation. And so when we search those questions, and really the hero's journey is a 12-step program. So that's what Joseph Campbell would say. Follow that 12-step program. Challenge yourself. Go into the world. Do service. Do all these charity works. Do these. Work. That's basically. There's no magic potion except working. That's all I've been able to distill from this. It doesn't necessarily change the formula in terms of work, but it might give you more incentive. Like, look, this is what I am. I'm supposed to be bigger and greater and part of something bigger, transcendent. And that is the beginning. That question is the beginning of the journey. And, you're taking risks and you're going through this process. And at the end of the journey, the 12th step is you have to keep coming back and bring others with you. وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ, right? Once you have become, so Buddha is a great example of an individual reaching nirvana. But when you go back to Moses is like the next level where he comes back to his people. And Jesus takes us to another level. Muhammad takes us to another level. That means everyone has to go through this and become their full self. Otherwise, the creation doesn't reach its full potential. everything is moving towards perfection. This is a law of nature. And all of these cycles that we experience, even the most evil things that we experience, are part of the process. Yes?
Thank you, Dr. Razfar. We had a whole semester looking at Khadija, Fāṭimah, Salam, and Zainab, and found very little information on the initial years of Hazrat Fāṭimah, her adolescent years, and then her marriage years. There's very lack of historical reference, especially when you take into consideration that of the four holy women, Khadija and Fāṭimah were the only two that obviously were close, the mother and daughter. I wonder when the Fāṭimiyyahs created the University of al-Azhar, what kind of information was available to them? I mean, they could have called the university Imam Ali University because he's the one that wrote Nahj al-Balagha and everything, Peak of Elegance. But what caused them to call that university al-Azhar and not something else? I mean, did they have, with all the books that were burned, have we lost a lot of historical context on who she really was from an ilm perspective?
I don't know much about to what extent the Fāṭimiyyahs leverage that, but I can say this, is that there were a lot of manuscripts that are now being uncovered that were not in the libraries, they were not in the public domain, but they were kind of held by closer companions. And so, as you know, the Fāṭimiyyah, they were a sect of Islam known as the Ismailis, I believe. And they were kind of, they had these manuscripts that elevated Fāṭimah's station. So that, like the hadith I mentioned to you, that Fāṭimah is the hujjat upon the imams. They had this very, they had this kind of mystical approach. And the more you study mystical text, you understand that in actualizing the divine attributes, there are basically two categories of attributes. There are the masculine characteristics, which are like the jalal, and then there are the feminine characteristics, which are the jamal. And most of the attributes of the divine are jamal, are feminine. And we're talking spiritually right now. We're not talking about the physical. And I know in the Fāṭimiyyah collection, they had many of these manuscripts that emphasize this point. And they followed this kind of more mystical path. And Salahuddin, or Kharabuddin, depending on your perspective, he came and they wanted to restore Islam to kind of that more chauvinistic, masculine, and legalistic type of Islam. And so they burned all these books. But some of them have been discovered in modern times, just like the Dead Sea Scrolls and all that. And that would be an interesting thing to kind of follow up on. Because right now we're living in a time where a lot of manuscripts, and this is true of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, a lot of manuscripts that were kind of not mainstream are being uncovered. And through this discovery, it is pointing to these things that were considered heretical. To say like, Fāṭimah is the hujjat upon the creation, that's like a heretical belief in mainstream, in that narrow version of Islam that was, especially that chauvinistic kind of religion that was being practiced. These were not beliefs that were endorsed, so you don't see a lot of artifacts about it. You only find them in very small circles. I will talk about this at a later time if there's an opportunity, but you may have all heard about the discovery in Switzerland, of tombs of Vikings. And in these tombs, they found that on their kafan, they wrote the word Allah and Ali, right? And they're trying to wonder, like, where did they get this from? Why did they write it on their clothes and be buried in it? I mean, if someone's burying themselves in these names, that means it's important to them. So that's like happening right now as we speak. And similar discoveries are being made because a lot of this knowledge, I mean, look, Fāṭimah, the story of Fāṭimah in a lot of ways is an oppressed story. It's a repressed story in the Muslim consciousness because these stories of heroines have kind of always been challenging the dominant male version of religion, right?
You know, given that Imam Ali was such a mounting intellectual, and during the time of Omar Abu Bakr al-Uthman, he was writing and putting on Arabic grammar, I'm curious if him and Hazrat Fāṭimah had dialogues intellectually, and when they were going to create this university, some of these things we've lost over the years because naming the first university after al-Zahrāʼ must have a context. It can't just be, let's just name al-Zahrāʼ.
Sure.
Right?
Because that was their ideal. That was their goal. They understood this is the goal, this perfection. Look, this is a place of perfection. This is a person. Al-Zahrāʼ means the enlightened one, right? This is a place of light. So they had that as their archetype. So when you name a university after that, it means this is our mission. This is our mission statement. And the Muslim world, quite frankly, has suffered ever since. When they abandoned the light, they went into darkness. Quite literally, right? Quite literally.
That was a very, your speech was a very unique and different way, a very traditional topic. I appreciate that. I enjoy it and appreciate your approach to this. I kind of got lost when in Portuguese cities and those three ladies saw the light. Did you say that was, Catholic believe it was Mary?
They believe it was Mary, yeah.
What? Did you say Muslim believe it's not Mary?
No, I didn't say that.
That's what I was talking about.
Okay, so
what do we say?
one of the attributes of Fāṭimah, out of the 135 names that we see, one of them is Maryam Kubra. So Mary, in some ways, is Fāṭimah at that time in history. You know, is the same
That's
image.
what I don't see. Why do you say that? What is the timing? Is what do you?
Right. So historically, you're right. If you were to look at it historically and the physical dates and all that stuff, you're right. But why is Fāṭimah in the Muslim tradition known as Maryam Kubra? Why is she known as another Mary? So yeah, you're right. It is the Lady of the Rosary. The Christians and the Catholics say this is Mary, but it's in the city of Fāṭimah. So they're looking at this as this is some kind of convergence. This is the universal feminine archetype appearing to say Mary and Fāṭimah are the same essence, the same light. And this kind of requires a more not a literal interpretation, but when people are interpreting this, these are the discussions they have. So we're talking about an apparition. We're not talking about a physical image of Fāṭimah. These pilgrimages and things that are happening to the city of Fāṭimah in Portugal are not the result of people seeing the physical Mary or the physical Fāṭimah. It's that they're seeing an image. They're seeing a spiritual apparition. The word is...
If I understand this correctly, you're saying that event which happened in 1917, it was beyond just a physical event. It was
for the way they're interpreting. For me, linguistically is the connection, because apparition and phantom and these are all the same word. So for me, the linguistic convergence is very interesting. That you have this amazing linguistic convergence evoking this universal archetype of the divine image, right? And so you have to kind of know that story. What are the Catholics, how is this story inspiring the Catholics? Why are they doing pilgrimages? It's like the greatest pilgrimage right now in the Catholic world, going to that city, Fāṭimah, Portugal, which was named by a Muslim caliph, right? His daughter's name was Fāṭimah, but in This century, the Catholics are saying at this city appeared the Lady of the Rosary. She never said, I am Mary. They don't say that this person said, I am Mary. They said, this person said, I am the Lady of the Rosary. So you go interpret that however you want. We have Tasbih Zahra, they have Lady of the Rosary. It's pretty, on a denotative level, it's pretty close. It's literally the same thing. So, we are not arguing about the body and the historical, sociological. We're talking about a spiritual experience, which transcends time and space. And that is what language at the connotative and meaning level is doing for us, right? That's what these archetypes are. They're not, Joseph Campbell is taking all these heroes, and essentially the critique of Joseph Campbell's work is that he's taking only 3 male archetypes. So we need to build on that work. And that's why people are saying like the Heroines Journey is a much more difficult journey, because they have to overcome patriarchy, they have to overcome masculine domination, they have to overcome chauvinism, all these things that are kind of embedded in society, and they have to rise above it. And that is like the final act, I think, in the divine story, is the revelation of this light, which is the heart of who we are, not the surface.
This is the last question.
Thank you very much. This is a very thought-provoking speech. I really appreciate it. One final question, and that is, I need a little bit of clarification. When you mentioned that when you related Fāṭimah linguistically to the essence that God created human man by, human mind. Are you implying that the essence of Hazrat Fāṭimah, which is the daughter of the Prophet, is closest to that which God, blew into this thing and said, "Here, I created that." Are you implying that by saying that, or?
I'm not implying it. I'm saying it.
You're saying it.
And I'm not the one saying it. I was quoting traditions that point to that the feminine image was blown into, is the more complete and more representation, the most intense manifestation of the divine at that moment of creation. And that is something you'll find in almost all of the mystical texts from a lot of traditions. I haven't read all of them, but they kind of talk about this developmental process, that the masculine attributes are the more obvious and things that you see. And this is not male and female in the biological sense. We all have both potentials, right? But the attribute of Rahman and Rahim, these are all expressions of, these are considered more of the Jamal, the beauty, the nurturing, the merciful kinds of attributes. And these are, I began to talk by saying Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This is the goal. But there's also the counter to that, which is Bismillah Wahid al-Qahhar, like the one and the powerful. So these are the more visible. Those are the things when people demand for, like, I want to see the earth split. I want to see the ocean wide open. Those are the expressions of that kind of power. But the feminine power and the feminine signs are not like that. They're considered the more subtle and esoteric and the heart of the message. And that's the end game. That's where we're trying to get to. We're trying to realize those attributes. And perfection, the process of perfection, from what I've understood, is really the realizing of all these divine attributes within. Right? And the closer you get to the absolute, the more you're getting closer to the divine. And yes, this image, this is the most intense image of the divine. It's the highest energy, if you will. It is the first creation. So we have that moment where you're going from the absolute creator to the creation. This is the first creation. This is the first image of the divine, and then that was cast into this body called Adam. I don't know if that's...
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much for